At 6:30 on May 10, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig stood at the edge of a muddy jungle clearing on the island of Mindanao, watching an army disappear. Column after column of exhausted American and Filipino soldiers marched down the road toward Japanese prison camps. Their uniforms were torn. Many limped from untreated wounds. Rifles had been stacked in surrender piles hours earlier. Now the men walked silently under armed guard. By the end of the day, 78,000 soldiers would surrender across the Philippines. Fertig did not move. He was 41 years old, a mining engineer from Colorado, not a career soldier. Before the war, he had spent 6 years in the Philippines supervising road construction and bridge projects for mining companies. He knew the mountains. He knew the villages. He knew the people. And he knew what surrender meant. Word of the Bataan Death March had already spread across Mindanao through whispers, traders, and guerrilla couriers, the so-called bamboo telegraph. Thousands of prisoners had been forced to march 60 miles under the tropical sun. Men who collapsed were beaten, bayonet, or shot. Some were buried alive. Others were beheaded simply to terrify the rest. The Japanese did not treat prisoners as soldiers. They treated them as expendable labor. Fertig watched the last column disappear around a bend in the road. The jungle swallowed the sound of marching boots. He now faced a simple choice: walk into a Japanese prison camp and probably die, or walk into the jungle and become a hunted man. He turned without a word and stepped into the rainforest. Mindanao was not a small island hiding place. It was a continent of jungle. At 36,000 square miles, it was larger than the state of Indiana. Towering volcanic mountains split the island into isolated valleys. Rivers carved through dense rainforest so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Roads were few. Entire regions could only be reached by footpaths known only to local tribes. The Japanese controlled the ports, the cities, and the coastal roads. But the interior was another world entirely. Christian farming villages in the north. Muslim Moro communities in the south who had resisted foreign invaders for centuries. Remote tribal settlements hidden deep in the mountains. And somewhere inside that wilderness were other Americans who had refused to surrender. But refusing surrender carried a price. The Japanese announced strict orders across Mindanao. Any American soldier found outside captivity would be executed immediately. Rewards were offered for information. Villages suspected of helping guerrillas were burned. Families were sometimes executed in public as warnings. Japanese patrols combed the mountains. Anyone hiding in the jungle was prey. Fertig's first weeks were miserable. He hid in the remote camp of an aging American settler named Jacob Diker, who had lived in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War decades earlier. Malaria struck almost immediately. Fever left Fertig weak and shaking for days. From the hills above the road, he watched Japanese convoys pass below. Prison columns. Civilians forced to bow to soldiers. Villagers beaten for the smallest acts of defiance. The Philippines was being crushed under occupation. And during those feverish weeks, Fertig began thinking about something that seemed completely impossible. What if the scattered Americans hiding in the jungle could be organized? What if the Filipino resistance groups could be united under one command? What if an army could be built in secret, in the middle of enemy territory, without weapons, supplies, or outside contact? The idea was absurd. Fertig knew it. He was not an infantry commander. He had never led troops in combat. His entire career had been spent designing roads and managing mining operations. But he also understood something most soldiers did not: systems. Engineering was about solving impossible problems with limited resources. And the problem in front of him was simple. If the Japanese controlled the cities, then the resistance would control the mountains. In July 1942, Fertig made a decision that would change the war on Mindanao. If the resistance was going to exist, it needed leadership. And leadership in the Philippines meant one thing above all else: rank. Filipino soldiers respected military authority. They would not follow a lieutenant colonel when other colonels and generals were rumored to be hiding across the island. So Fertig solved the problem in the most unconventional way possible. He promoted himself. He found a Filipino metalsmith in a remote village and asked him to melt down silver coins. From those coins, the man fashioned 2 rough silver stars, the insignia of a brigadier general. With those stars pinned to his collar, Wendell Fertig, mining engineer from Colorado, declared himself commander of United States forces on Mindanao. There was no official order, no approval from Washington, no confirmation from General Douglas MacArthur, who had escaped to Australia weeks earlier. Just a decision made in a jungle clearing. But sometimes authority begins simply because someone claims it. On September 12, 1942, Fertig formally announced his command. By sunset that same day, he was the most wanted man on Mindanao. The Japanese began circulating descriptions of the mysterious American general rumored to be organizing resistance. But Fertig faced an even greater problem than Japanese patrols: the guerrillas themselves. Mindanao's resistance fighters were scattered across the island in dozens of independent groups. Some were former Philippine Army soldiers. Others were civilian volunteers. A few were simply bandits who used the war as cover for robbery. Many fought each other as often as they fought the Japanese. If Fertig wanted an army, he first had to unite them. His breakthrough came in the mountains south of Lake Lanao. There he met Captain Luis Morgan, a Filipino officer of mixed American and Filipino heritage. Morgan had been fighting the Japanese since the surrender with a small band of armed men. Morgan understood something immediately. The guerrillas would never unite under a Filipino commander. There were too many rivalries, too many tribal loyalties, too many historical grudges. But they might unite under an American, because an American represented one powerful idea shared across the Philippines. MacArthur would return. The Americans had not abandoned them. Morgan agreed to become Fertig's executive officer. Together they began building a resistance army out of scattered fighters and village militias. But the island remained dangerously divided. Christian Filipinos in the north, Muslim Moro tribes in the south, mountain tribes who trusted no outsiders at all. Each group spoke different languages. Each carried centuries of suspicion toward the others. The Japanese exploited these divisions expertly. Informants were paid in rice and money. Rumors spread that the United States had abandoned the Philippines permanently. Every village Fertig entered could betray him. And he still faced one final problem. Even if he built an army, no one outside Mindanao knew it existed. Fertig had no radio, no communication with MacArthur, no way to request weapons, ammunition, or supplies. His guerrillas fought with ancient rifles, homemade shotguns, and sometimes only beyond-the-lookout knives, against an occupying army of 50,000 Japanese troops. 3 weeks after the first faint transmission crackled across the Pacific, a reply finally arrived from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. But it was not the answer Wendell Fertig expected. The signal from Australia was cautious, even suspicious. Anyone could claim to be an American officer hiding in the jungle. Japanese intelligence had already experimented with fake radio stations designed to lure Allied submarines into ambushes. MacArthur's staff demanded proof. A series of questions followed, personal details that only the real Wendell Fertig could answer. His wife's name, his hometown in Colorado, where he had attended school, the mining company he had worked for before the war. Fertig answered every question correctly. Still, the silence that followed lasted days. To MacArthur's intelligence officers, the situation sounded almost absurd. A mining engineer hiding in the jungle claiming to command an army of guerrillas on an island occupied by tens of thousands of Japanese troops. It sounded either like a trap or the delusions of a man who had spent too long in the jungle. When the next transmission arrived, it was blunt. MacArthur would not recognize any promotions made in the Philippines during the occupation. Wendell Fertig would revert to his official rank of colonel. If he wanted support from Australia, he would follow orders and prove that his guerrilla army actually existed. Fertig read the message carefully. Then he folded the paper, placed it in his pocket, and pinned the silver stars back onto his collar. To Australia, he was Colonel Fertig. But on Mindanao, he was still General Fertig. And to the Filipinos who followed him, that rank meant everything. The message from Australia carried a far greater meaning than the demotion. MacArthur knew they were there. They had not been forgotten. In March 1943, the war came to Mindanao in the most unlikely way possible. A dark silhouette surfaced quietly in the waters off the northern coast of the island. It was the American submarine USS Tambor. The submarine carried only one passenger, Commander Charles Chick Parsons, a U.S. Navy intelligence officer who had lived in the Philippines before the war. Parsons spoke fluent Tagalog and understood Filipino culture better than almost any American officer. His mission was simple: find Wendell Fertig and determine whether the so-called General of the Jungle was a brilliant organizer or a dangerous fraud. Parsons traveled inland through guerrilla territory, escorted by armed Filipino fighters along jungle trails and river crossings. What he found stunned him. Fertig had built an army, not a ragged band of fugitives, but an organized resistance network operating across much of Mindanao. Independent guerrilla bands had been unified under a single command structure. Filipino officers were being trained in discipline and logistics. Intelligence networks were already operating inside Japanese-occupied cities. Coast watcher stations along the shoreline reported Japanese ship movements. Couriers carried messages through jungle trails. Scouts tracked Japanese patrol routes across entire provinces. And all of it existed in territory occupied by 50,000 Japanese troops. Parsons spent days observing the operation before returning to the coast. When he finally boarded the submarine for the return voyage to Australia, he carried a clear recommendation. Wendell Fertig was not insane. He was building exactly what MacArthur needed: an army behind enemy lines. After Parsons' report reached Australia, the situation changed overnight. American submarines began appearing off Mindanao's coast on a regular schedule. Each arrival was dangerous. Submarines surfaced only at night on remote beaches. Guerrilla fighters moved silently through the surf, carrying crates from the submarine's deck to waiting boats. The cargo was never large, usually only 4 to 7 tons per mission. But for an army that had been fighting with homemade weapons, the supplies were transformative. Crates contained rifles, ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, explosives, and occasionally machine guns. Submarines such as USS Tambor, USS Thresher, and USS Bowfin became the guerrillas' lifeline to the outside world. Once the cargo reached shore, a complex supply network took over. Small boats carried the crates up rivers into the interior. From there, carabao carts hauled supplies along jungle trails. Finally, porters carried ammunition and medicine to hidden guerrilla camps scattered across the mountains. Every shipment traveled through territory where Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. But the supplies kept coming, and the resistance kept growing. The Japanese noticed the change. Guerrilla attacks were becoming more frequent and far more organized. Convoys were ambushed on remote roads. Bridges were destroyed at night. Telephone lines and supply depots were sabotaged. These were no longer isolated acts of resistance. Someone was coordinating them. Japanese intelligence began hunting for the source. Captured guerrillas were interrogated. Civilians were tortured for information. Patrols combed the mountains searching for a mysterious American commander whose name appeared repeatedly in reports. Fertig. By the summer of 1943, the Japanese had placed a price on Wendell Fertig's head. The exact amount was never recorded, but it was large enough to tempt almost anyone living under occupation. Fertig had become the most hunted man on Mindanao, and his army was only beginning to grow. But Fertig understood something that Japanese commanders did not. Weapons alone would never hold Mindanao. The Japanese could always send more soldiers, more artillery, more aircraft, but they could not rule an island whose people refused to accept their authority. So Fertig began building something far more ambitious than an army. He began building a government. By mid-1943, guerrilla-controlled regions of Mindanao operated under a civil administration modeled after the Philippine Commonwealth government that had existed before the war. Provincial governors reported to Fertig's headquarters. Municipal officials handled local administration. Courts settled disputes between civilians. Hospitals treated wounded fighters and sick villagers. Schools reopened to teach children in English rather than Japanese. Messages traveled between towns through a crude but effective postal system carried by guerrilla couriers. Then Fertig did something even more remarkable. He created a currency. The guerrilla government printed its own money, guerrilla pesos. The notes were crude. Some were printed on scraps of paper. Others were stamped by hand. But merchants across Mindanao accepted them, because Fertig promised something extraordinary. When MacArthur returned, the United States would honor every guerrilla peso at full value. Fertig had absolutely no authority to make that promise. But the Filipino people believed him, and belief was enough. The guerrilla government accomplished something the Japanese could never achieve through force. It gave Filipinos a reason to support the resistance beyond hatred of the occupation. Inside guerrilla territory, people found something rare in wartime: justice, education, medical care, hope, and word began to spread. American servicemen who had escaped capture slowly found their way through the jungle to Fertig's headquarters. Soldiers who had refused to surrender. Pilots shot down over Mindanao. Sailors from ships sunk in Philippine waters. By the end of 1943, 187 American servicemen were serving in Fertig's command. Each brought valuable skills. Former infantry officers trained combat units. Radio specialists operated communications networks. Mechanics repaired captured Japanese equipment. With these new resources, Fertig organized his growing force into 6 guerrilla divisions, each responsible for a different region of Mindanao. In the north, Christian Filipino fighters ambushed Japanese convoys along the coastal highways. In the south, Moro warriors used their knowledge of swamps and rivers to strike Japanese outposts and vanish before reinforcements arrived. And along the coast, the guerrillas created something almost unbelievable: a navy. Small merchant vessels were armed with salvaged machine guns and improvised cannons. One boat was armored with circular saw blades taken from abandoned lumber mills. These strange warships attacked Japanese supply barges and coastal patrol boats. During one engagement, a guerrilla sailing ship armed with a 20mm cannon shot down a Japanese bomber. It may have been the only sailing vessel in World War II to destroy an aircraft. But Fertig's most powerful weapon was not rifles or boats. It was information. Across Mindanao, guerrilla agents began building an intelligence network that grew faster than any army. By 1944, 58 radio stations operated across the island. Coast watchers monitored Japanese ship movements. Agents in occupied cities counted troops, mapped fortifications, and reported supply shipments. When American submarines hunted Japanese shipping near the Philippines, they relied heavily on Fertig's intelligence reports. By June 1944, MacArthur's intelligence staff counted 169 guerrilla radio stations operating across the Philippines. The largest and most effective network belonged to Wendell Fertig. For MacArthur planning the liberation of the Philippines, this information was priceless. But the Japanese were not standing still. And soon, they would launch a massive campaign designed to wipe Fertig's invisible army from Mindanao forever. When the Japanese launched their major offensive against the guerrillas, they expected a decisive battle. They never got one. Fertig's forces did not stand and fight. Instead, they vanished. Guerrilla units broke apart into small groups and melted into the jungle. Headquarters staff buried radio equipment, burned documents, and dispersed to prearranged hiding places deep in the mountains. Ammunition caches were hidden beneath bamboo floors. Supply depots were dismantled overnight. Wendell Fertig himself never slept in the same place twice. Guided by Filipino scouts who knew mountain trails the Japanese had never mapped, he moved constantly through the rainforest. The Japanese columns pushed deeper into the interior, expecting to find a headquarters, an army, something they could destroy. Instead, they found abandoned camps, cold fire pits, empty clearings. The jungle had swallowed the enemy whole. Japanese patrols that ventured too far from the main force began disappearing. Small groups of soldiers were ambushed silently at night. Supply lines were cut by improvised bombs made from unexploded Japanese shells. After 6 exhausting weeks, the offensive collapsed. Japanese troops were sick with malaria and dysentery. Morale had collapsed under the strain of fighting an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The columns withdrew back to their coastal garrisons. Within days of their departure, the guerrillas returned. Radio stations came back on the air. Supply routes reopened. Civil government offices resumed operation. It was as if the Japanese offensive had never happened. The Japanese tried again. Another offensive in October 1943. Another in early 1944. Each followed the same pattern. Japanese troops advanced into the mountains with thousands of soldiers. Guerrillas vanished into the jungle. Weeks passed with little progress. Ambushes increased. Disease spread through the Japanese ranks. Supplies ran short. Eventually, the troops withdrew again. And every time they left, the guerrillas returned stronger than before. Japanese commanders slowly began to understand the truth. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an entire population. Every Filipino farmer could be a spy. Every village could hide weapons. Every jungle trail might lead into an ambush. To truly control Mindanao, the Japanese would have needed to garrison every town, guard every road, and watch every civilian. They did not have enough soldiers. Worse still, their brutality was making the situation far worse. Japanese troops burned villages suspected of helping the guerrillas. Civilians were executed as warnings. Prisoners were tortured for information. But every atrocity produced the opposite result. Farmers who had tried to stay neutral joined the resistance after seeing neighbors murdered. Young men who had hidden in the mountains came down to volunteer for guerrilla units. The Japanese were creating the very army they were trying to destroy. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence estimated that Fertig commanded more than 30,000 guerrilla fighters. The true number was impossible to know. Fertig's organization blurred the line between soldier and civilian. A farmer might plant rice in the morning and carry ammunition to a guerrilla camp in the afternoon. A fisherman might transport supplies by boat at night and sell fish in a Japanese-controlled market the next day. The entire population had become the resistance. Japanese headquarters in Manila reached a grim conclusion. Suppressing the Mindanao guerrillas would require a force larger than the garrison occupying the entire Philippine archipelago. A captured Japanese staff document summarized the problem in one line. It is impossible to fight the enemy and at the same time suppress the activities of the guerrillas. Then everything changed. In October 1944, American forces landed on the island of Leyte, 300 miles north of Mindanao. MacArthur had returned. The liberation of the Philippines had begun, and Fertig's guerrillas were suddenly no longer an isolated resistance movement. They had become the forward element of an invasion. Every Japanese soldier they killed weakened the defenses facing the Americans. Every supply line they cut slowed Japanese reinforcements. Every report they transmitted gave MacArthur's planners priceless intelligence. Submarines began arriving with greater urgency than ever before. One of the largest submarines in the Pacific Fleet, USS Narwhal, could deliver nearly 100 tons of cargo in a single trip. Crates of M1 rifles replaced the ancient Springfields and homemade weapons the guerrillas had used for years. Thousands of rounds of ammunition allowed entire units to prepare for sustained combat. Radios, explosives, and medical supplies poured into guerrilla camps across the island. MacArthur's headquarters issued new orders. Fertig's forces were to intensify sabotage operations. Telephone lines were cut across the island. Bridges were blown apart with American explosives. Japanese messengers were ambushed on jungle roads. The goal was simple: isolate the Japanese garrison on Mindanao. Prevent them from coordinating with forces on other islands. Prevent them from requesting reinforcements. Prevent them from even understanding what was happening. The guerrillas responded with a campaign of systematic destruction. In November 1944, sabotage teams cut the main telephone cables connecting Japanese headquarters in Davao to garrisons across the island. Repair crews sent to fix the lines were ambushed. When the Japanese switched to radio communications, guerrilla direction-finding teams located the transmitters. Coordinates were sent to American aircraft. Within hours, Japanese radio stations were destroyed by bombing runs. Transportation networks collapsed. Bridges were blown apart. Roads were blocked by fallen trees and disabled vehicles. Convoys that once traveled freely between cities now required heavy escorts. Even then, ambushes inflicted constant casualties. A Japanese battalion that once needed 2 days to move between garrisons now required nearly 2 weeks. The intelligence flowing to MacArthur's headquarters became extraordinary. Coast Watcher stations reported Japanese ship movements in real time. Agents inside Davao counted troop numbers, identified unit insignia, and mapped defensive positions. By the time American planners began preparing for the invasion of Mindanao, they possessed more detailed intelligence than for almost any other operation in the Pacific War. Japanese commanders now faced an impossible dilemma. American forces were advancing across the Philippines. Leyte had fallen. Luzon was under attack. Every available soldier was needed to defend against the main American offensives. But removing troops from Mindanao would leave their garrisons vulnerable to guerrilla attacks. Leaving troops on Mindanao meant fewer defenders where the Americans were actually landing. The guerrillas had created a strategic paralysis. In desperation, Japanese headquarters ordered one final offensive against Fertig's strongholds. If the guerrillas could be destroyed before the American invasion, thousands of soldiers could be redeployed elsewhere. In early 1945, Japanese columns once again marched into the mountains. And once again they found the same enemy they had faced for 3 years. Empty camps, vanishing fighters, ambushes on every trail. The offensive was still underway when American forces finally arrived. On April 17, 1945, soldiers of the 24th Infantry Division landed on the western coast of Mindanao. They expected weeks of brutal fighting. Instead, they encountered something astonishing. Fertig's guerrillas had already cleared the beach defenses. Japanese troops that should have resisted the landing were dead, wounded, or trapped in the mountains by guerrilla roadblocks. As American soldiers advanced inland, they were greeted by uniformed Filipino fighters who had already been fighting the war for 3 years. Men who knew every jungle trail. Men who knew every Japanese position. Men who had already done most of the work. The once powerful Japanese garrison on Mindanao, originally 50,000 soldiers strong, was shattered and scattered. Wendell Fertig had delivered MacArthur an island. The liberation of Mindanao took weeks instead of the months American planners had expected. Instead of battling entrenched defenders, American troops pursued broken Japanese units already weakened by years of guerrilla warfare. Japanese soldiers who had once terrorized Filipino villages were now hunted through the same jungles where they had hunted Fertig. By June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Mindanao had effectively ended. Small groups still hid in remote mountain valleys. But strategically, the battle for the island was over, and it had been decided long before the first American landing craft touched the shore. When the fighting finally ended, the scale of what Wendell Fertig had accomplished became clear. For 3 years, an island occupied by 50,000 Japanese soldiers had resisted through guerrilla warfare. Military historians later calculated that Fertig's forces had killed more than 7,000 Japanese troops during the occupation. Thousands more had been wounded. Entire divisions had been tied down guarding roads, hunting resistance fighters, and protecting supply lines. Those were soldiers who could have been sent to fight American forces elsewhere in the Pacific. Instead, they spent the war chasing shadows in the jungles of Mindanao. When the island was finally secured, Fertig was summoned to meet General Douglas MacArthur. The same headquarters that had once questioned whether Fertig was a fraud or a man driven mad by the jungle now saw something very different. MacArthur praised him as one of the most effective, unconventional warfare commanders of the war. Fertig had done something no military academy had ever taught. He had built an army out of nothing. No supply lines. No formal authority. No outside support for months at a time. Yet somehow he had united thousands of Filipinos, organized resistance across a massive island, and held off a modern occupying army. The awards followed. Fertig received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. The citation noted that he had continued his mission even though a large price had been placed on his head, and he lived in constant proximity to enemy forces. He also received the Distinguished Service Medal for organizing a disciplined and highly effective fighting force that confined Japanese troops to fortified areas across the island. The Philippine government awarded him its highest military honors. But the recognition that mattered most to Fertig did not come from medals. It came from the men who had fought beside him. Filipino guerrillas who had faced tanks and artillery with homemade weapons. American soldiers who had refused to surrender and survived 3 years in the jungle. Coast watchers who risked execution to report enemy ships. Radio operators who kept the fragile communications network alive under constant threat. Together, they had created something unprecedented. A resistance army that had not only survived, but helped win the war. The strategic impact of the Filipino guerrilla movement extended far beyond Mindanao. Across the Philippine archipelago, guerrilla forces tied down more than 288,000 Japanese troops during the occupation. Nearly a quarter of those soldiers were assigned solely to rear area security, guarding roads, bridges, and supply depots against partisan attacks. Every battalion guarding a road was a battalion not fighting American Marines on the beaches. Every soldier hunting guerrillas was a soldier not defending a Japanese airfield or coastal fortress. The resistance movement had multiplied American combat power without costing American lives. Japanese commanders understood the problem too late. Their own reports described the impossible mathematics they faced. Suppressing guerrillas required large numbers of troops. Those troops had to be pulled away from frontline defenses. Weaker defenses meant faster American advances. Faster advances meant less time to destroy the guerrillas. The cycle could not be broken. After the war, American military planners studied Fertig's campaign carefully. He had not been trained in special operations. He had not attended elite command schools. He had been a mining engineer from Colorado. Yet he had instinctively understood something professional armies sometimes overlooked. Guerrilla warfare was not primarily about killing the enemy. It was about building an organization. It required legitimacy, discipline, intelligence networks, and the support of the population. Victory did not come through one decisive battle. It came through 1,000 small victories that slowly made the occupier's position impossible. These lessons would reshape American military doctrine for decades. When the Cold War began, the United States realized it might one day need to organize resistance movements behind enemy lines again. Officers who understood unconventional warfare would be critical. Wendell Fertig's experience suddenly became extremely valuable. In the early 1950s, Fertig helped develop a new concept within the U.S. Army. Specialized units trained not only for combat, but for organizing resistance movements, conducting psychological warfare, and supporting Allied populations under occupation. From 1951 to 1953, Fertig served as a Special Forces Planning Officer and Deputy Chief of Psychological Warfare at Army Headquarters. He helped establish the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. That center would later become the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, the training home of the U.S. Army Green Berets. Every Special Forces soldier trained there would learn principles that traced directly back to the jungles of Mindanao. Fertig retired from the Army in the mid-1950s. He returned to Colorado and resumed his work in the mining industry. He lived quietly, rarely speaking publicly about the war. On March 24, 1975, Wendell Fertig died at the age of 74. He had never written a memoir. He never tried to turn his wartime story into fame or fortune. He simply returned home. But in the Philippines, he was never forgotten. When Fertig returned to Mindanao after the war, thousands of Filipinos lined the streets to greet him. Some wept openly as they sang, "God Bless America." During the darkest years of occupation, he had given them something more powerful than weapons. He had given them hope. Hope that they had not been abandoned. Hope that the Americans would return. Hope that liberation would come. And he had kept that promise. Military historians later ranked Fertig among the greatest guerrilla leaders in modern history, alongside figures like T.E. Lawrence and Mao Zedong. Yet his path to that list was almost impossible to imagine. A civilian engineer, a man with no prior command experience, a leader who built an army of more than 35,000 guerrillas from scattered refugees hiding in the jungle, a force that held an island against 50,000 occupying troops for 3 years. Some guerrilla units even made bullets from melted scrap metal and curtain rods when ammunition ran out. Yet they fought on. The Filipino government preserved his memory. Veterans organizations honored the guerrillas who had served under him. The story passed from generation to generation. The American general who refused to surrender. The man who promised that MacArthur would return. The leader who kept that promise alive for 3 long years. Fertig understood something many military academies struggle to teach. Wars are not won only by firepower. They are won by people who believe their cause is worth fighting for. People who trust their leaders. People who see a future worth sacrificing for. On Mindanao, Fertig gave the people all 3. For 3 years, 50,000 Japanese soldiers hunted one American engineer. They never captured him. They never destroyed his army. They never conquered his island. Some men are remembered for the battles they fought. Wendell Fertig should be remembered for something even rarer. For the army he built from nothing. For the nation he kept alive in the jungle. And for the hope he preserved when hope seemed impossible.